It is noon. Welcome everybody to Food Systems Friday with Prescott College. As many of you know, I have a particular feelings of urgency about issues related to our food system, so I like to get started on time. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The folks that you can see on your screen here are our panelists, who I will be introducing in just a moment. So please just admire the view while we get through our introductions. But I'm so pleased that Sharon Palmer, Sara Reinhart, and Chris Vogliano have joined us here today. So welcome to the 5th episode of Food Systems Fridays, organized by the Sustainable Food Systems faculty at Prescott College. My name is Robin Curry, and I'm the director of the Master of Science in Sustainable Food Systems program, which is an online program that seeks to support students in their efforts to build a more sustainable food system in their own communities. So we've been online for quite some time. This is not new, but our webinar series is new. We're an online program with intention because college towns seem to collect a disproportionate number of academic activists, but our hometowns need our students as they're applying what they're learning in the classroom to improve their food systems. As we know, many faculty and teachers have moved online, and so please feel free to incorporate this webinar into your teaching content. We'd be thrilled to have more folks learning about food systems. The reason that we launched this webinar series is because we know that there are families all over the country and all over the world encountering situations where they cannot find the kinds of foods they're used to and the amounts that they are used to. The spotlight is definitely on food supply chains, and clearly many of our existing food systems are not equitably ensuring good food for all, even in the best of times. For those of you who are less familiar, food systems encompass all of the stages of keeping us nourished. That's growing, harvesting, packaging, processing, distributing, transforming, marketing, consuming, and then hopefully not too much waste of food. We are avid advocates for sustainable diets at Prescott College. Sustainable diets are diets with low environmental impacts, most often with more localized supply chains that can play an important role in ensuring food and nutrition security. And that is our topic for today. As a faculty, we are also thinking about the increased vulnerability to food insecurity that has happened as a result of isolation measures associated with the COVID-19 virus. This shows us more now than ever that we have important work to do to ensure safe and resilient food systems. So the question in front of us is, how do we get this right? The Food System Friday series for the near future will focus on policies, practices, and the people, like we have on our panel today, who can show us and help us to learn about models of sustainable food systems and sustainable communities. So our topic for today is eating without sustainability: how dietary guidelines can protect our health and the environment. For next week, we'll be airing at the same time, so please stay tuned for details. If you registered for the webinar, you receive the details for the next webinar in your inbox, along with the recording for the current week's webinar. You're all welcome to keep an eye on the Food Systems Friday website also, and we'll get that link posted up in the chat session. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Dr. Lisa Chokia. Lisa hails from Appalachian, Ohio. She's a faculty member in the Sustainable Food Systems program and academic activist for food systems. She's host of the Capstone, which is a brand new podcast that launched that celebrates food system research and the capstone projects of our students who are in the MSFS program. This week she'll be helping to facilitate facilitate the chat and also moderate the question and answer session. I really encourage you to listen up as Lisa is going to speak about how to participate in the chat and the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you, Robin. I appreciate that. I'm going to circle back around to our topic today and to formally introducing you in your role as moderator, and then you'll introduce our illustrious guests. But before I do that, as you said, I just have some quick Zoom housekeeping to run through with everyone. I know some of you may have joined us before for Food Systems Friday webinars, and if so, you know the drill. But for those of you who may be joining a Zoom webinar for the first time, I just want to take a few minutes to familiarize you with the functions, which are a little bit different than just a basic Zoom call. First off, the webinar is being recorded. So we make this available free via our website for folks who are unable to attend. So please understand that your participation in the chat, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, constitutes your agreement really to allow Prescott the option to capture what you've expressed or the resources that you shared to distribute as part of the webinar series. So anyway, the first technical thing to note is that for the duration of the webinar, your audio will be muted and your video will be off. So that's a little different than the normal Zoom call. And this is just how the webinar platform works so that we can focus our attention on the speakers. You'll be listed in the chat as a participant by either your name or your phone number, depending on how you've logged in. So I just want to assure you, though, that this information does not show up on the transcript of the webinar, which is made available to the public. And so finally, to the chat function. If you take your cursor and you place it at the bottom of the page, it'll bring up the toolbar. You'll see a talk bubble. This is a toggle that'll bring up the chat space. So you can go ahead and click on that now. And I'd recommend leaving it up so you can interact with each other and ask questions, share resources as our speakers are presenting. You'll see a blue rectangle that tells you who you'll be communicating with if you send a message. So if you click on that box, you'll see your options. As Robin mentioned, this is really a great community building space. So again, I invite you to all just pop on right now and say hello, introduce yourselves, tell us where you are today, maybe say what you're hoping to get out of the webinar. Feel free to share your contacts with us, with the panelists, with each other. Also, in addition to that chat space, you can also ask a question for the speakers in the Q&A space, which you find, you can access that at the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom page as well. So I'm going to be the person monitoring, as Robin said, both of these spaces during the webinar in case you encounter any technical problems, if you have comments or questions for the speakers, you want to share resources, whatever. This chat space is very dynamic. It's spontaneous, it's resource rich. So really, I encourage you to participate as fully as you can. So let's move on to the reason why everyone is here today. As Robin said earlier, as a graduate program in sustainable food systems here at Prescott College, we really strive to engage our students with the issues and the challenges in the food system that present themselves as immediate. But our North Star, if you will, is to continually frame these issues as they relate to more complex systems. As I always remind my students, everything is connected. So we advocate for changes that can make a difference right now, but always in ways that are linked to shifting systems in the long term. So today's topic is a really great example of this kind of complex systems approach, highlighting how food system sustainability can be improved by what we eat and how we grow and raise our food. Food-based dietary guidelines, including the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, provide advice on what to eat for wellness, what foods, food groups, and eating patterns, but what we eat and how we grow and raise our food also impacts the long-term sustainability of our food system and our planet. So, the current pandemic in particular highlights key social and economic issues related to U.S. food production and distribution. And as a result of the COVID-19 restrictions, many of us have had to make changes to our eating patterns in the short term, and we may be wondering about the long term. So mindful that dietary guidelines establish a basis for public nutrition, health, and agricultural policies, this panel is going to discuss sustainable diets and the importance of including sustainability research in the formulation of national dietary guidance. So we met Dr. Robin Curry, today's moderator, at the top of the webinar, but I'd like to formally introduce her now. I will put her bio information in the chat, which is sort of a link to a more complete bio, but basically Robin is faculty and director of the Master of Science in Sustainable Food Systems program at Prescott. Her work focuses on food systems at the nexus of nutrition, agroecology, micro-entrepreneurship, and rural finance for smallholder farmers. So Robin, thank you for moderating today. I'll hand the privilege of introducing our distinguished guests over to you now, and I'll nip on over to the chat space.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate the framing and the introduction. And now I get to introduce more folks. So I'm so glad that you're all here. I want to start by introducing Sharon Palmer. I'm going alphabetical by last name. Lisa will kindly be putting their detailed bios in the chat. So keep an eye on your chat while I do brief introductions, so we have plenty of time for our panel. So Sharon Palmer is an associate faculty member with us here at Prescott College and is currently teaching a course on sustainable diets and biodiversity that we're really excited about. She's the founder of SharonPalmer.com and is known as the plant-powered dietitian.
Whoops, it sounds like Robin had a little freeze there. Well, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, does everybody else still hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. Well, yes, SharonPalmer.com. I'll just put that in there, and if anybody's got any other questions, they can contact you through there. I'll just go ahead and really go ahead with the introductions. Sara Reinhart is the other panelist, and Sara is the lead food systems and health analyst for the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In her role there, she applies nutrition science and public health research methods to develop policy positions in support of a more healthful, sustainable, and equitable food system. So let's see if we can just sort of put a little lengthier bio in there for you to have some more information about Sara. The other panelist is Chris Fogliano, and he is a globally recognized public health dietitian who is passionate about creating healthy and sustainable food systems. Chris has expertise in alleviating food insecurity and promoting healthy diets through programming, policy interventions, and strategic partnerships. He's currently working on a project with Biodiversity International and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization focused on preserving and supporting indigenous food systems. So I will put that quickly in the chat and we can get started and hope that Robin is able to join us. All right, well, so let me throw this out there and just ask, what are sustainable diets? We've talked about that a lot so far. Why are we hearing more about it, but maybe not enough? Who wants to take that on?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa, and great to for everyone to be on the call. I'm really excited to be a part of this webinar, so I appreciate you guys inviting me. And also thanks, Lisa, for saying my name, last name correctly in Italian. That's really good.
Paisan, what can I say?
Excellent. Yeah, so just to answer a question around sustainable diets, there are so many definitions out there, and it is such a complex topic, as we'll discover as we continue to move through this webinar. But in its most simple form, I would say sustainable diets are diets that can healthfully feed current and future generations with having low environmental impacts. And I'd actually like to take a second to read the FAO's definition of sustainable diets. It's quite long, but I think it really encompasses all of the aspects of sustainable diets and really kind of helps paint a picture on how many pieces diets do touch across the food supply chain. So the FAO's definition is sustainable diets are those with low environmental impacts, which contribute to the food and nutrition security and for healthy lives for present and future generations. They're also protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. They're culturally acceptable, accessible and economically fair, affordable, nutritionally adequate, while optimizing natural and human resources. So, that's quite a long definition. But in my work, I really like to categorize sustainable diets into just 4 dimensions. I think it's easier to digest in our brains to think of 4 different aspects of sustainable diets. And those are socio-cultural, nutrition and health, economic, and planetary health. And I know throughout this webinar, we'll be going into more detail around all of those. But just to paint a quick picture, sociocultural is around gender equity or cultural considerations for food and dietary patterns. For instance, some cultures may eat a certain food or may not eat certain foods. Nutrition obviously is around either undernutrition, overnutrition, obesity, the multiple burdens of malnutrition, and the nutrient density of food supplies. The economic dimension takes into account farmer wages and fair wages along the entire food supply chain, all the way to consumers, where affordability of healthy and sustainable diets plays a role. And then lastly, the one that we'll probably be talking about quite a lot today is planetary health. And that includes anything from food loss, food waste, food system greenhouse gas emissions, land and water use used for food production, and biodiversity loss and biodiversity considerations for food systems. So I know that was a lot of information, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, and apologies for disappearing in the middle of introducing our wonderful panel. Talk about a Zoom moment, but here we are. I think, Chris, you covered it in terms of the definition of sustainable diets, and I think that it's important that we start with a shared understanding of what it is that we're speaking about today. So I think what I would like to transition to is, even though you had a brief, though interrupted introduction to all of your backgrounds, I think that it would be helpful for everyone listening in today about what all of you all are doing in the context of sustainable diets. So I would love, maybe we'll start with you, Sharon. I would love to have you talk about your most recent research or most recent projects that you're working on related to sustainable diets, and then we'll ask the others to chime in also.
Great. Well, thanks, Robin. So I'm really involved not only in teaching students at Prescott about sustainable diets, but in my world as a dietitian. I'm engaged with dietitians, educating them about sustainability, adding that to their knowledge base, because I feel passionately that healthcare professionals have access, to so many people, the public. They're well respected professionals. Research shows that, in particular, dietitians are very well respected and influential with consumers. So I feel like that's a great touching point. So if dietitians can help educate consumers about sustainability. So I'm working a lot in that area in education. I'm also engaged in the community through my blog and my books about eating a more sustainable plant-based diet. That's kind of my thing that I'm passionate about. So I have books on plant-based nutrition. I have a new book coming out this year on plant-based nutrition in my bioregion of California. And I'm writing a lot of articles. I just have an article that I finished for Oprah magazine. So I'm engaged in that way too, trying to just communicate all of these consumer-friendly ways people can live and eat more sustainably.
Excellent, thank you. Chris, how about you're up next? We'd love to learn a little bit more about what your role is in researching and on the ground projects related to sustainable diets.
Sure. Thanks, Robin. Happy to share. So, like Sharon, I also am a registered dietitian and have worked in nutrition and dietetics for nearly a decade now. It's crazy to think about. But I've actually gone back to university, and I'm actually getting my PhD. And through my PhD, I'm looking at sustainable food systems and sustainable diets in Melanesia, which is a ethnogeographic area of Pacific Islands. So my PhD location's in New Zealand, but my research is actually in Solomon Islands, which is a Pacific small island developing state. And here we're really just trying to understand where are the food systems at and where are the transitions going, and what kind of implications is this going to have on food sovereignty, on health, and looking forward, how is climate change going to impact the food systems? Because as of right now, there's really no baseline data to understand what the transitions have been and where the future projections are. So my research is dedicated to just really understanding and building a picture so we can help mitigate and, or rather, make more resilient food systems in Pacific small island developing states. In addition to that, I'm working with Sharon on a project working on empowering healthcare professionals to become leaders in sustainable food systems. And I'm also working on a project with Gain and Tufts looking at global dietary quality through Gallup polls. So really exciting. I think the next few years we'll have some pretty interesting data looking at over 120 countries and the quality of diets in those countries. So stay tuned for that. Thank you.
I don't want to wait for the results of that. I'm already curious, but I guess I'll have to wait. No pressure, Chris. No pressure, Chris. Thank you very much. And Sara, what have you've been busy lately, so I'd love to get an update.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me, and it's fun to see all these names pop up in the chat. Sounds like we've got a good group here, and also wonderful to be in the company of other registered dietitians. So yes, last month, which is maybe a year or 10 in our current circumstances, I did publish a systematic review on sustainable diets with colleagues from the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science and Policy, and some of my colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists where I work. And for those who maybe aren't familiar, the Union of Concerned Scientists is a national nonpartisan nonprofit. We work to support science-based and democratic policymaking to address challenges to human health and the environment. And my team in particular works on food systems issues. So developing evidence-based policies that represent the perspective of some of the most marginalized communities and can help address a lot of the challenges that we're seeing to healthy food production, healthy food access, and things like that. So I think we're going to maybe dive into the dietary guidelines a little bit later on, but just a brief background on why we decided to do this paper that just came out. I think most folks might know that the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee was asked to review the sustainable diets literature for the first time. And their findings in a nutshell were that diets higher in plant-based foods, lower in animal-based foods tend to be healthier and more environmentally sustainable. That didn't sit super well with industry interests, and so that didn't sit super well with the USDA. And foregone conclusion, those were not included in the 2015 dietary guidelines. So because of all that controversy, we actually have the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, as we speak, developing their scientific report. But we really didn't expect them, 2 years ago to be talking about sustainability, and they weren't asked to revisit that topic. So our colleagues kind of put our heads together and said, well, we could do that, I guess. So we did. We used publicly available methodology based on what the 2015 committee used, and we updated that body of research. So just a quick highlight of some of those findings. I'm happy to dig deeper later, but as we sort of suspected, the body of research on sustainable diets has just grown by leaps and bounds since it was last evaluated in 2015. It's enormous. And we found that between July 2015 and September 2019, there were 95 new peer-reviewed papers on this topic, including 22 on the US alone, which, just for a little frame of reference, that is more than 4 times the number of articles that were published between 2000 and 2015 in just a quarter of the time. So just an enormous growth in this literature, which is really exciting to see. Beyond that, we had 2 primary findings. The first, which surprised us a little bit, I would say, actually challenged prior findings that diets that are in alignment with national dietary guidelines are more sustainable than current average diets. So we kind of challenged that prior idea, because our results showed that the primary dietary pattern that the dietary guidelines recommend, which is called the healthy US style diet, could actually result in similar or greater heat trapping emissions, energy use, and water use compared to what we're eating right now. So that was sort of an aha moment, where we thought, all right, this is this is something we should probably be talking about in the development of the DGAs. And of course, the second finding, I mentioned that the 2015 committee did generally report that diets higher in plant-based foods, lower in animal-based foods tend to be healthier and more environmentally sustainable across the board, generally speaking, and our study confirmed that finding as well. So we have a lot more information about what sustainable diets look like in the US. There are still some really important questions we need to answer, but I think this took us a step further in being able to evaluate that body of research.
I'm not sure where to go now because there was so much information that you shared. I think for context for some of the folks, I've been watching some of the introductions. So a part of our audience are registered dietitians who have been actively engaged in this process of, trying to look at sustainability and take that into consideration in the dietary guidelines for Americans. Whereas other folks that whose names are popping up in the chat, I recognize because some of them are my students, for example, and some of them are less well versed in this. So maybe what makes sense right now is for us to pause and let's talk about what the dietary guidelines, and in this case, let's talk about for Americans, because that's what your research is focused on more most recently. So what are they? And I think we need to break it down from the consumer eater perspective, but then also from the policy perspective. And so if we could start there.
Sure. So from a 500-foot level, the dietary guidelines are basically the most comprehensive set of evidence-based nutrition recommendations that we have in the United States. And the purpose of the guidelines is to promote health and prevent chronic disease. And generally, they're intended to do that for a healthy population. So in the past, they have not made any recommendations based on, certain chronic disease states or, certain populations with special needs. They're primarily intended to be sort of a general guide for the population. And it can be a useful tool for the general public. So I know folks who will read the dietary guidelines of their own volition and kind of use those as a benchmark for their diet. And, a lot of us are probably familiar with My Plate or its clunky predecessor, the Food Pyramid, which were both based on dietary guidance. But I think what surprises folks is that the actual intended audience of the dietary guidelines is actually federal nutrition programs. And when I say federal nutrition programs, I'm talking about the National School Lunch Program. WIC is for Women, Infants, and Children. Child and adult care food programs. So all these different federal nutrition programs that help provide food for various populations. That's actually what the dietary guidelines are meant to inform. And those programs serve millions and millions of families, kids, seniors, veterans, you name it, every single year. So those programs are meant to align with these evidence-based dietary guidelines. Whether that is the case is debatable. For example, school lunches are kind of a good case study on this. So the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, which folks might be familiar with, that Michelle Obama championed back in 2010, that was a landmark piece of legislation, and that reformed school meals for the first time in decades. And it was really significant in that it did bring school nutrition in much better alignment with dietary guidelines. And then during the past few years, we've seen this administration roll back some of those regulations, and suddenly they're not quite in alignment with dietary guidance anymore. Point being, we really don't have a strong mechanism for the implementation of the dietary guidelines. So yes, they're intended to be targeted towards federal nutrition programs. Do they always do that successfully? And is there necessarily accountability behind that target? Not always.
Yeah, thank you. I look to the other panelists here to chime in if there's anything else that they'd like to comment on in terms of what, you know, the perspectives are on the role of the dietary guidelines for Americans. Oh, mute.
There we go. Yeah, I think, Sarah, you did an excellent job summarizing it, and I'm not sure if we'll get into this later, but the controversy around the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans was the inclusion of sustainability as a piece that is important for not only people's health, but the planet's health. And the Scientific Advisory Committee in 2015 concluded that plant-based diets were better for people and had lower environmental impact. So while the Scientific Advisory Committee wanted these recommendations in the dietary guidelines, the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, I think, was it Tom Vilsack? I'm pretty sure him and his team decided that it wasn't in the scope, and it was, I think, using his words, coloring outside of the lines, and they omitted it from the dietary guidelines. So that's really where America's at with trying to squeeze in sustainability in the dietary guidelines. And I'm sure Sarah has more information on the 2020 dietary guidelines and where sustainability fits in those.
I just wanted to add that, you know, I do a lot of writing and, you know, engaging with the community, and people will access the dietary guidelines as just the general rules, recommendations for healthy eating, even though, you know, as Sarah mentioned, they're designed for feeding programs and you know, federal guidelines in that way. But, you know, this is what journalists will refer to, and throughout nutrition education, dietitians use these as a tool all the time. So they are really important. If we get them right, they have an enormous impact, I believe, even though you might ask an average consumer if they've ever heard of them, maybe somewhere along the way, whether it was in their education system or speaking with a dietitian, they may have gotten that information. So I think they are important.
I think maybe what makes sense for us to do is maybe spend a little bit more time explaining how this all comes to be, how the dietary guidelines for Americans come to be. Because in our responses, we've talked about that process that happened in 2015, and we've mentioned that there's a advisory committee that is put into place. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about what the role of that advisory committee is, and then sort of what, you know, from a policy perspective, you know, then what happened in 2015, you know, to provide a little more context, and then maybe to loop back, Sarah, to what your efforts have been most recently on, you know, working with the 2020 committee, but then also where things are in the policy process. So really, from a policy perspective, can you explain how the dietary guidelines for Americans have come to be? And everyone else can please feel free to chime in.
Sure. So to open up our history books for a second, the U.S. government has been publishing dietary guidelines since 1980, excuse me. They've been publishing those every 5 years, although they weren't required to by statute until 1990. And it was around that time that the government started developing the guidelines with a scientific committee made up of experts in health, medicine, nutrition, typically folks who are leaders in their fields. And what typically happens is the US Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services, so two major federal agencies, will work together to lead this process. They actually alternate every cycle who actually takes the leading role, but they work together throughout this process. They appoint this committee of experts, typically somewhere around a dozen people, although this 2020 committee actually has 20 members because for the first time they're addressing pregnancy, birth, and through 24 months of age nutrition. So they're a little bit larger. And throughout that time, there's a comment period when groups can help nominate experts. And then there's a comment period that lasts throughout the deliberation of this committee. So, you know, having worked directly with some of the folks at USDA who've been managing this process, they've done a really phenomenal job, I'd say, of managing a really rigorous and pretty heavy process and making sure that the public has points of accessibility there. So once that committee is appointed, they meet over the course of about 2 years to review current evidence on topics that have been selected, typically topics that, you know, they're either new or they're, you know, particularly problematic at that time, kind of emerging topics or topics that have seen a lot of growth in research. And a small difference between past committees and current committees is in the past, the committee has sort of been able to shape the topics that it wanted to review. During this current cycle, the administration actually shaped those with public comment before the committee was appointed. So that was one different aspect of this cycle. But the way the committee function works is basically they form subcommittees, they develop protocols, and then they review the evidence using a pretty rigorous methodology that goes hand in hand with the USDA Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. So that's a team at the Department of Agriculture who knows their stuff, and this is what they do. So they're working in tandem with this team, and eventually, after a lot of hard work and review and opportunity for comment, the committee will reach its conclusions, produces a scientific report, and at that point, that report gets delivered to the USDA, HHS, and then they will draft the final guidelines. So it's a really detailed process. It's a long process. And where we are right now, the scientific report is actually set to come out in late June or early July. And that was just bumped back a month just due to current circumstances. But as far as I know, the federal government is still expected to be on time to publish final guidelines by the end of 2020. I will say, and you know, I want to be clear that the whole process where the committee is, you know, developing protocols and working with the USDA, having been at all 5 of these public meetings, having followed the process really closely, it's pretty scientifically rigorous, and it's structured so that there really isn't a ton of room for bias to seep in there and really, you know, influence any scientific recommendations. That being said, when that report gets handed from the scientific committee to the US Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services, that's when you sort of see that transparency and accountability drop off the map a little bit. So Chris mentioned that, you know, in 2015, it was the Secretary Vilsack and Secretary Burwell from HHS that eventually came out and said, you know, sorry, but sustainability is not within the scope of the guidelines. And that happened, you know, from the public perspective. You know, the public saw the scientific report that said sustainability is important, here are recommendations. And then next thing they knew, you know, the secretaries are saying, no, it's off the table. So that, you know, there is kind of a black box there where things stop being transparent. And that was what was really controversial in 2015, was sort of this sense of having the rug pulled out under you. Like, we saw this whole process develop, and then all of a sudden, what happened to the sustainability recommendations? So we are hearing that there's going to be greater accountability and transparency this time around, and a justification of, you know, anything that is or isn't included. And we're hoping that's the case, because what we've heard about from the current chair, Barbara Schneeman, of the committee right now, is that they are planning to discuss sustainable diets in what they're calling an integration chapter of the report. So our hope is that, we see that discussion and that it really brings in both the 2015 review of evidence and a review of current evidence, and that we have the opportunity to, watch that recommendation go through to the agencies and hopefully not, get lost somewhere along the way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that explanation, because I think a lot of people really don't have a firm understanding of how that process works and where the science obligation lies and responsibilities lie, but then where the political process begins to take place. And I think that with a clearer understanding of those different points, then, a more aware scientific community and a more aware public may have more to say about these issues moving forward and may know to pay attention a little bit more, because to have to have that scientific information in papers, for example, like the one that you led, to make sure that the most recent research is up and available and that people are aware, is critically important to this process. But there's another political process that's happening alongside of that. And so one of the things that I want our focus to be, on the dietary guidelines for Americans and sustainable diets in the United States, but not exclusively. And I know, Chris, that you have been working on dietary guidelines, but from a more global perspective. And so I wondered if you might comment on similarities, points of convergence, points of divergence, and how these processes are operating globally. And then also what, maybe to start getting us into thinking about what some of the sustainability themes are in terms of diets. Like, what is it that, we could and should be doing? And are there synergies globally?
Sure, happy to answer that. So, I published a book chapter last year on the themes of food-based dietary guidelines around the world with the lens of sustainability and understanding which featured sustainability indicators, which actually call them out as being sustainability indicators, and which didn't. And since then, I believe that it's been updated a bit, so forgive me if my numbers are a bit outdated, but this should be pretty close. Currently, right now, food-based dietary guidelines are available for 90 countries, 7 in Africa, 17 in Asia and the Pacific, 33 in Europe, 27 in Latin America and the Caribbean, 4 in the Near East, and then 2 in North America. Lower income countries typically are the ones who do not have food-based dietary guidelines. For instance, Africa, as of 2019, only had 7 countries that actually had food-based dietary guidelines nationally, which I found pretty interesting. And there seems to be some guidance across food-based dietary guidelines that is pretty universal. For instance, consuming a variety of foods. That's something that you can find in almost every guideline. Consuming certain foods in higher proportions, such as fruits and vegetables, legumes, you can find that in most guidelines. Eating animal source foods and limiting fat, sugar, and salt. Those are also fairly universal. Where variances come in are aspects of sustainability, such as guidelines around how much dairy and red meat to consume, what types of fats, where to source our fish from, oils, nuts, etc. And what we found was that there were 13 countries that actually featured aspects of sustainable diets within their guidelines. Let me back that up really quick to clarify that. So there are 8 countries that have specific guidance around eating a healthy and sustainable diet. But only a few of those, only 6 of those call them out as being sustainability indicators. So some actually do say, follow sustainability science, but don't necessarily call it out, while others do. And then 2 actually had scientific advisory committees that wanted it to be included in the guidelines, like Sarah was saying, and America was one of them, and Australia was also the other one. But as it got to actually turning them into policy, the sustainability indicators did drop off.
Mm-hmm.
So where we see some similarities, even though the visual representation might be different, it's actually quite interesting to go through dietary guidelines and see how countries represent what my plate should be. So obviously in America it's a plate. In Canada, they've updated theirs. It used to be a rainbow. In China, it's a pagoda. In Estonia, it's a pyramid. Germany, it's a circle. Qatar, it's an oyster, interestingly. And then Sweden, it's actually a traffic light. So it's quite interesting to see the similarities and differences on the visualization of the dietary guidelines. But the common elements, some of the common elements are the promotion of plant-based diets, the moderation of red meat or processed meats, moderation of dairy consumption, encouraging sustainable seafood consumption. So not understanding where your seafood comes from and encouraging to buy and consume from more sustainable sources. Some actually do link ultra-processed foods and sustainability. The only one that we found that actually addressed water conservation within cooking was Qatar, but obviously they're in a very dry part of the world, so that's a very urgent and pressing issue for them, but imagine that will become more pressing in dietary guidelines when we move forward. Promoting local and seasonal foods. There are 7 dietary guidelines that talk about that. Behavioral and exercise, cooking, etc. like that. Animal welfare is another one that appears, and we found 3 different guidelines that talk about animal welfare. And then also food packaging and waste reduction. So there's a lot of different sustainability indicators that we found. Not all of the guidelines mention all of those, but kind of is scattered throughout. Yeah, and I think that sums up my kind of overview of it. But if there's any specific questions of what we found, I'm happy to discuss.
Yeah, and it sounds like another commonality has to do with, there's the scientific process, and then there's the political process, especially with your acknowledgement of, of what happened here in the United States in 2015, and then also Australia in the mix, and perhaps in other country contexts also where there was a more where the political process was more interested and concerned about the sustainability aspects, and that's why that came through. I wanna turn to Sharon now, if I may, for this question, because I know that this is what you do. Chris, you mentioned these commonalities that came out, and then also Sara, you mentioned this as a finding from your most recent systematic review with your colleagues on aspects of sustainable diets, and that higher plant-based, lower animal based diets are more sustainable. And I wondered if you could speak towards that. So sort of why is that the case? Oh, Sharon, the mute. Yeah.
About that. As we've been talking about today, there are a number of studies that have shown that plant-based diets are more environmentally friendly, and these are we're collecting more and more of these studies so that we have a body of research that shows that plant-based dietary patterns are more environmentally friendly. And it's related to a number of measures such as greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, energy use. All of these issues we've been looking at and finding that these plant-based dietary patterns are more environmentally friendly in these ways. And it's really involved in terms of animal agriculture and our modern food system being more intensive, especially when we look at ruminants. So that would be red meat in particular, beef, sheep, lamb. Those are the ones that produce more methane. So that's mostly beef in the United States. These have higher greenhouse gas emissions due to the methane. And then we also, in our modern food system, produce food to feed animals over their lifetime. So there's the impacts of growing all that food, and then the water that's needed for the animal over the lifetime. And then there's the processing, the transportation throughout the food system for animal products. So the research quite consistently shows that these foods have a higher impact. So when we have dietary patterns that are high in red meat, those dietary patterns are associated with a higher environmental footprint compared to dietary patterns that are plant-based. We have a lot of research, for example, on the Mediterranean diet being a lower carbon footprint, lower environmental footprint diet pattern. And the Mediterranean diet is very plant-based, with seafood as the main animal protein. We also have a lot of research on specific plant-based patterns, such as vegan and vegetarian diets being lower in environmental footprint. And now we have cohorts in the United States, as well as the UK, India, China, Taiwan, that are looking at these epidemiological studies that are finding very similar results in dietary patterns. So when we look at plant-based diets that are filled with pulses, which we know are one of the most sustainable protein sources, things like beans and lentils and dried peas. We look at whole grains, and we look at more fruits and vegetables in the diet. This is the dietary pattern that's linked with a lower environmental footprint. And it's been consistent in literature, and as Chris was bringing up, that's one of the commonalities that we're seeing when people are making sustainability recommendations, that's one of the big things people can do.
And that was a wonderful summary. I might add on to that as well, just the impact of food waste. I know that was brought up by Chris too, but some of the studies that came up in our systematic review, they would review the impact of this diet versus that diet, and then they would say, but if you want to be, have the greatest impact, just reduce your food waste. I mean, the amount of food we waste is incredible. So I would just add that on too, as saying that it's a both and situation of let's make responsible dietary shifts, and reducing food waste will go a long way to help us conserve resources.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And in America, we're wasting 40% of our food. There was a study that came out just a couple of weeks ago that showed that it could even be more than that. So just think of all the inputs involved in producing food that will never be consumed. So that's just low-hanging fruit in my mind. So food waste is a huge issue, especially in Western nations.
Right. To piggyback off that, Sharon, I entirely agree. And in Western countries and more developed countries versus lower income countries, food waste happens at the end of the food supply chain. So it happens with consumers and in restaurants. And really, it puts the onus on us to actually make a difference, which it really puts the power in our hands too. That, reducing food waste, as Sarah said, is such an easy, low-hanging fruit, an easy way to make a difference. If you're looking at lower middle income countries, usually food waste happens at the beginning of the food supply chain. So it's more of a transportation or refrigeration issue, etc. So obviously resources would be filtered differently there to solve those problems.
Well, I'm checking the time. I want to keep having this conversation. Can we just keep doing this for another hour? I think with there's been a lot of news during this last week about food waste, and I know that I feel like we still have so much to say about dietary guidelines, and I do just want to make a quick acknowledgement. I see that Angie Tagtow has joined us, and Angie was really a leading voice in bringing these sustainability issues up for our dietary guidelines in 2015. So I want to acknowledge her and all of her hard work, and she's the reason we're having this conversation here today. Before we transition a little bit, because what's been in the news this week has been all of the food waste. We have dairy farmers having to dump milk. We've had all sorts of issues with spoilage because we haven't been able to make adjustments in food distribution systems because of the changes in institutional purchasing. And so we're hearing a lot about our food system right now in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And I would like to hear from the panelists about what the current circumstances are telling us about sustainable diets.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I think the current circumstances are just really pulling back the curtain on how fragile our food system is. and how much it relies on exploitation of natural resources, but also of the people who make our food system work. So, you know, I think that's always been true, and probably is very obvious to people who've been deeply embedded in that system for a long time, but it's now really on display for the general public because of this major disturbance that's happening to our food supply. So Robin, you mentioned, you know, this huge misalignment in our supply chain and waste and dumping, but, you know, I think we're also seeing and learning a lot among the general public about our labor force and the people that are producing our food, who are underpaid, who are really poorly protected from health hazards.
Yeah.
Even before the pandemic, our food chain was employing, I think, 1 in 7 workers in the US, paid the lowest hourly median wage to its frontline workers. And, you know, farm workers alone, about half are undocumented. And so you've got a huge population who, you know, they're being underpaid, they're being subject to labor violations with no recourse, have no benefits to fall back on. And aren't even eligible for some of the financial stimulus, you know, aid that's being offered now. So, so I think that's a huge issue that we're seeing right now. And when we talk about sustainability, like Chris mentioned in the beginning, you know, we hear so much about environmental sustainability, and that's where a lot of the research, you know, points us. But there is so much we need to be doing from a social and economic perspective to make sure that the folks who are producing our food, you know, can continue to do so and make a livable wage and protect their health and their family's health. So that's something that the Unit of Concerned Scientists has been working on a little bit, and trying to support organizations like the Food Chain Workers Alliance, United Farm Workers, United Food and Commercial Workers, who have been fighting for a lot of these basic protections for a long time.
I just wanted to add to that was right on. I agree with what you're saying, Sarah. But what I've observed in my bioregion in Southern California is just how our local food systems, the distribution channels, can be disrupted so easily in our modern food system. So I live in an agricultural area, and all the small farmers had no distribution for their local food products. So literally, supermarkets were out of produce, and farmers are tilling in over their crops because they have no access channels. And for example, a lot of local farmers are distributing to restaurants. Those restaurants are now shut. And the supermarkets have not been able to circumvent their distribution channels to go to the local farmers. And if farmers markets are being shut down, it just shows you that how important the local food system is in finding distribution channels to get to consumers. I think that's a really important part, and it really highlights to us how important it is to have these local food systems in communities, so that at least some food is staying in that region in case of emergencies.
Excellent points. I don't have too much more to add. But the other thing I did want to call out, though, is just the vulnerability of the low-income populations within America during crises like these, you know, during unemployment and during stressful financial times. The uptick of people leveraging food bank services has just been exorbitant, and people that have never used food banks before are lining up for hours just to make sure that they have food. So I wanted to give a shout out to nonprofits like Feeding America and the National Network of Food Banks that are doing really, really important work during this time to get food to those in need, especially when, you know, the National School Lunch Program and the breakfast programs are not running and in service. So I'm glad that there are options like that, but it really does, as Sarah said, highlight and kind of lift up the veil of how fragile our food system can be. And hopefully moving forward, we can use this as a lesson to learn where we can strengthen our food system and make it more resilient in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And I think this brings us back full circle, right? Because the majority of our food security support programs are, you know, grounded or at least financed from the federal government. And this is what brings us back to the importance of the Dietary Guidelines and the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and this dialogue that's happening. It's not a dialogue, it's a scientific research process and then a political process, and let's hope that there can be some positive synergies that are acknowledging these longer-term sustainability issues and concerns that will result in a more resilient food system in the future because our shortfalls are visible. I want to acknowledge that we're at the 1 hour mark. I know that some people have, just that amount of time available to them, but I also want to let everyone know that the panel is here and we're going to open up for Q&A. And if you have to go, please know that if you registered, you'll be able to get the recording emailed directly to your inbox. And if you didn't register and just found the URL and joined us, the recording will be available on our website, on the Food Systems Friday website also. So you'll be able to hear the responses. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Lisa now, because she's been doing a great job of curating the questions that have been coming in. Lisa.
Hi, thanks. Well, we've had a few, and I'm just going to roll right out of the box with one that is a little controversial. It's a contested issue, I think, with regard to the science behind the recommendations on eating less red meat and dairy, being somewhat tied to the industrial production methods. So the question is, what is your response to smaller scale, community-based, regenerative animal agriculture relative to sustainable diets?
So I guess I could take that one. I think a lot of the research that has been done on comparing plant-based diets with diets that are higher in animal products have been done with the modern food system, with using traditionally conventionally produced meat. So that's definitely one kind of highlight that I think it's important to bring up in the research. When we look at these large studies, we're looking at average populations. And so this is based on the conventional food system in terms of the meat production. There's not a lot of research that compares plant-based diets with, in terms of sustainability footprint, with meat diets that are based on some of these more sustainably produced meat products. So I feel like that's kind of lacking in the research. So it's really hard to make conclusions in that way. But I definitely believe that these more sustainable methods of producing meat can make an impact. And I think this kind of less better meat sort of strategy, personally, I feel like that's a great strategy for consumers to target. Less meat, but higher quality meat that's more responsibly produced, sourced, getting to know the producers, looking at practices, all those kinds of things.
And I would pile on to that saying, I wish I had our agroecologist in my chair right now. She's done some really great work, Marcia DeLonge, on regenerative grazing and just trying to compare different systems. But we also, in doing this research, as Sharon said, it becomes very clear where most of the data is coming from, and it's not from, your managed grazing systems and rotational grazing. And it's, so I think there is a really important role there to play for small farmers and ranchers, or mid-sized farmers and ranchers, that we really need to do a better job of capturing in the data.
Yeah, excellent. No, just to add on though, I think Sharon had a really neat point where it's better meat but less meat, and I really think that less meat is still really relevant for the average American. The stats show we're consuming around 200 pounds of meat per person per year. And if we were to scale that up globally to let everyone, have everyone consume that amount, there wouldn't be enough land to have regenerative agriculture grazing practices to produce that much meat. Land use is, I think, agriculture already uses 50% of desert-free and ice-free land as is. So if we were to spread out even more, we'd have to think of the biodiversity losses, the native land losses to do just that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was I just came back from New Zealand. I was living there for 3 years, and they are a pretty shining example of regenerative agricultural practice. Maybe not regenerative, but grass-fed beef, grass-fed lamb. That's how most of it's produced on the rolling green hills. It's absolutely beautiful. So many more sheep than people, times like 10, I think. I think there's 40 million sheep and 4 million people. So they have quite the livestock background. But one thing that New Zealanders are starting to realize is that much animal production, even though it is grass-fed, is having an impact on their environment. And as of now, 55% of their rivers and streams are unswimmable due to nutrient pollution because of runoff of animal agriculture. So actually there's a massive push in New Zealand to reduce meat consumption, even if it is more responsibly and not as industrially grown. So just throwing those 2 cents in there.
No, great. All great points. I appreciate everybody's response and weighing in on that. So yeah, we had questions that were kind of all over the place. So I'll just keep diving in. So one of the participants, Patty Miller, said, I'm glad to hear about the global research and wondering if, quote unquote, the USDA committee is diverse, inclusive, and representative of US populations.
I
Good
can take
question.
that one. Diverse in terms of expertise, yes. Diverse in terms of demographics and reflecting those of the US population, no. I just from a personal perspective, as I said, I think this committee's done a great job, so I don't mean to disparage them in the least, but I do think that was something that we were hoping for, was to see folks with maybe more expertise in social determinants of health, understanding diet-related health disparities, and certainly the demographic makeup of this committee doesn't necessarily match the US at large, if that's your question.
Yeah, I think it was. Let's see here. So kind of on that, is what are other ways to bring forward the idea of sustainable diets to the public besides through the DGA? So ways to tie in food and farm worker protections, affordability of food, food sovereignty, that kind of thing.
I wanted to just highlight one thing that's going on in the UK. Chris and I are both fans of the British Dietetic Association. I don't know if you are aware of them, Sarah, if you've looked at what they're doing. It's called One Blue Dot. Yep. So the dietitians in the UK have created this amazing resource for sustainability that is very consumer friendly. You can check it out. I just love their resources. I use it all the time. They're geared towards a UK population, but it talks about things like, meat reduction, seasonal local foods, food waste, even like hydration, the impact of poor hydration choices on sustainability. But the thing I like about it is they're really designed so that they would be easily digestible for consumers. So I do think that there's a place for more organizations. We have a number of amazing organizations here in the United States who provide great consumer resources, but we can always use more. What are some of your favorite sustainability resources?
I was just going to mention organizations like Healthcare Without Harm. They're an excellent organization that works with medical facilities to I think they work also in the medical waste side of things, but they have a food and nutrition arm that works on sourcing sustainable and local foods for the hospitals and using hospitals as an anchor point for designing more resilient regional food systems. And they have incredible resources on their website as well. It's Healthcare Without Harm.
Yeah, it's a great one.
Great. Here's another one. So accepting the connection between health and sustainability, and in particular, the importance of recognizing that connection as we face increasing climate disruptions, is at the core of seems like it's at the core of trying to move forward on developing dietary guidelines in the US. So are there things that citizens can do to influence policy in this regard?
So glad you asked. Yes, there is particularly right now, the public comment period is still open. And, as we mentioned a few times, this does only happen 5 years, every 5 years. So it's a really great opportunity now to go in, to take a look at, the dietaryguidelines.gov website. They've been pretty transparent about their protocols and their research. So, and I do know that they're collecting those comments and delivering those comments to the committee. So it really is kind of a neat opportunity to be able to provide input directly to those committees. And there are also, organizations you can follow. Unity of Concerned Scientists is not the only one, but we are one of several that, are engaging in advocacy and helping communicate opportunities to get engaged in those political processes.
Awesome.
Yeah, amazing. And I would just add, if the national level seems too far out of reach and maybe slow moving, you can always start local. Start in regional food policy councils are a great place to get connected with local, nutritionists and activists working to improve the food system. And there are food policy councils in almost every major metropolitan area.
Great. I'm glad you added that. That's a very good idea for folks to move on. I really didn't have too many more, but I had one really interesting question. What are your thoughts on the expansion of sea vegetable farming?
I actually just wrote an article about that. But so I happen to know a lot about that subject. But I've been very interested in that because it's been touted as the sustainable food of the future because it's so plentiful. And in fact, some of the sea vegetable species are invasive. I mean, they're being overgrown, so why not eat them? So when we look at some that are farmed, some are still wild, harvested. It doesn't take a lot of resources. We have this available product in our food system, and they're very nutritious too. We're learning more and more about the nutrient value of some of these plants. So there has been a lot written about in particular protein. Protein is always going to be the issue, the protein food source. So there's been a lot of interest in algae being the protein source of the future, in addition to things like insects. That's another hot topic. So I would really, a lot of food cultures around the world eat sea vegetables, and they're part of traditional diets. So I think that's something that would be good to embrace and start getting, introducing some of these things into our diets.
Love it. And just to piggyback on your protein comment, the other nutrient of concern, if we're cutting down on animal source foods, are omega-3s, not necessarily ALA, but DHA and EPA fatty acids. And those can be found in microalgae, which are now being grown to kind of supplement vegetarian and vegan lifestyles that want to get more DHA and EPA. So I see sea vegetables as a really untapped opportunity at this point, and there'll be a lot more growth in the future.
Great. Well, Robin, I'll turn it back over to you for concluding.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I think I am going to take one small opportunity for what I hope is not viewed as shameless self-promotion, but in terms of what, an ordinary citizen can do. I think our conversation here today has demonstrated just how complicated, these issues really are. I mean, we hear about sustainable diets, and, sometimes we may think that there's, just one simple recommendation. But actually, when we start digging into this concept, all of a sudden we see that there's a whole political dimensions, there's policy dimensions, which sometimes are separate from political dimensions, but rarely. But there's knowledge gaps, and the need for continued research, because Sharon had comments about, in terms of the research about, more sustainable practices in rearing our animals, and what impact that might have on food system sustainability, that we just still don't have that core research. And so I'd encourage those who are interested to learn more, to dig in. Our chat, we'll send the chat out along with the video. You'll get it in your inbox. And so I've seen there's been a lot of really wonderful resources shared. So I invite everybody who sees this webinar to engage in self-study, but then also to consider courses. Sharon's teaching our sustainable diets and biodiversity course right now. And there's a reason why we built that into our program, because as Sara's research shows, it is an emerging area. As Chris's research shows, we do need to be paying attention to these global themes and global trends for a more sustainable food system. We're at 40% of our ice-free and water-free land coverage devoted to agriculture and animal-based agriculture. And actually the International Panel on Climate Change, it wasn't even a year ago when their report came out that actually was looking at agriculture as both a causal agent in related to land management practices as a causal agent for climate change, but also offering opportunities for increased carbon sequestration. And, Sara, you mentioned that, there's energy impacts and water impacts related to what, our food choices are, but those aren't choices for everyone because of some of the structural barriers and issues in our food system. So it's complicated, and I want to thank Chris and Sharon and Sara for really bringing this level of complication to all of our attention, but also just the wonderful job that you all did in helping us to understand the different components of this, of these issues. So thank you, and I hope we get to have continued conversations on these issues. So I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so for our audience, we hope to see you again next week. Same time, so noon Pacific Daylight Time and 3 Eastern Daylight Time. So we'll see you back on Food Systems Friday. And I also invite you to check out Lisa's podcast, the Capstone, on whoever your podcast provider is for more insights into food systems research. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks everyone. Be well.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.